A woman brings gifts to an orphanage and sees a child who looks very much like her husband. Elena Smith was a 35-year-old woman with long black hair that gracefully fell over her shoulders and brown eyes that shone with kindness and compassion. Her beauty extended beyond physical appearance, reflecting in her generosity and love for others. Everyone in the community admired Elena for her dedication to helping others. She had a huge heart and always found time in her busy life to make a difference in the lives of those around her. One of her favorite activities was bringing gifts to the local orphanage. It was part of her charity routine, a way to bring a bit of joy and hope to the children who had no family. That sunny afternoon, Elena carefully and lovingly prepared the gifts. This time, she was going to visit an orphanage in a nearby town for the first time. She chose colorful toys, warm winter clothing, and even some children's books, imagining the smiles of the children receiving their gifts. Upon arriving at the orphanage, Elena was greeted with enthusiasm by the children who ran around her, curious to see what she had brought this week. Elena distributed the gifts with joy, savoring every moment with the children. It was then that her eyes met those of a particular child. His mischievous smile lit up his face, his blue eyes shone with innocence, and his black hair fell messily over his forehead. Curious, Elena approached the boy and handed him a toy. He thanked her with a soft smile, revealing a missing front tooth, which made him even more adorable. She asked his name, and he replied that it was Oliver. At 6 years old, Oliver had something captivating in his gaze, something that seemed strangely familiar to Elena, as if she already knew him from somewhere but couldn't pinpoint where. Days later, Elena was at her in-laws' house, where her mother-in-law, Mary, was excitedly looking at old photos of her children when they were young. Among the photos, Mary lifted one in particular of Charlie, her husband, with black hair, bright blue eyes, and a mischievous smile on his face. As she looked at the photo, Elena felt a strange sense of familiarity. That image seemed as real as if she had seen that boy before, but she couldn't remember where. The captivating smile and mischievous expression of Charlie in the photo were so similar to Oliver, the boy from the orphanage, that they left her intrigued. But she quickly brushed those thoughts aside. Elena decided to return to the orphanage in the neighboring town a few days later. She brought more gifts and donations, eager to see Oliver again. Upon arriving, Elena searched for the boy and found him sitting, focused on fixing a toy car. His eyes were focused, he seemed serious and determined to complete the task. In a moment of deep concentration, he scratched his chin and frowned, a gesture that reminded her so much of her husband, Charlie, who had the same habit when he was very focused or worried about something. The physical resemblance between Oliver and Charlie, combined with similar gestures, made Elena question even more, was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? The answer seemed increasingly distant, leaving her even more intrigued and determined to discover the truth. Days passed, and Elena couldn't shake those thoughts from her mind. Her mind was engulfed in a whirlwind of doubts and questions. She knew she couldn't tell anyone, especially her husband. He would think she was crazy, and she herself began to question the sanity of her thoughts. Elena wondered if she was right in her suspicions. Even if her husband had been unfaithful, why would the child be in an orphanage and not with the mother? Did he know about the child's existence? Had he abandoned him because he wasn't a legitimate child? No, Charles wouldn't be capable of that, she convinced herself. But, what if he was? What if everything she believed about him was wrong? These questions consumed her, making her rethink every detail of their relationship and the story they shared. One night, after dinner, Charles moved his right arm to scratch his wrist, revealing a small birthmark. Elena noticed it immediately, although she had seen that mark before. Charles noticed her gaze and, before she could say anything, explained, "It's a birthmark. Everyone in my family has one. You remember, even my sister has it." Elena nodded, trying to hide her true concern. That simple mark became an obsession for Elena. On her next day off, she decided she would go to the orphanage to check if Oliver also had that same birthmark. It was a clue that could confirm her suspicions but also scared her with the possibility of what she might discover. Finally, Elena's day off arrived, and she didn't hesitate to head to the orphanage. Anxiously, she looked for Oliver, trying to disguise her true intentions. She couldn't just grab the child's arm, she needed to be subtle in her approach. She found Oliver playing with other children, and when he saw her, he smiled broadly with his bright, captivating blue eyes. He ran to hug her. Elena returned the hug, liking the boy very much. For a moment, she allowed herself to be enveloped by Oliver's joy and innocence, almost forgetting the reason for her visit. However, when she remembered, she didn't even need to grab the boy's arm. Oliver was scratching his wrist exactly the same way Charles had done days ago. With a quick glance, Elena found the unthinkable. The same birthmark that was on her husband's wrist was also on the child's wrist. They were identical, only differing in size. Elena was in shock. Now there were too many similarities and coincidences. Secretly, she found a way to take a photo of the child's wrist, although she wasn't sure why she did it. Now, the question was what to do next. This discovery awakened a mix of emotions in Elena. She felt happy to be there, helping the children at the orphanage, but at the same time, a concern began to settle in her heart. The idea that the child might be Charles's son, the result of an affair, tormented her terribly. She tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing on enjoying her time with the children, but the doubt persisted in her mind, making her question the truth behind that surprising resemblance. Elena was distancing herself from Charles, unable to talk to him, as the mere idea of infidelity broke her heart. She avoided looking at him, pulled away when he tried to kiss her, and always avoided intimacy, claiming to feel unwell. In 10 years of marriage, this had never happened, and she knew he had noticed. From the beginning of their relationship, she had made it clear to Charles that infidelity would be the end of their relationship. They should be loyal and faithful. If the relationship wasn't going well, they would talk and try to fix it, and if that wasn't possible, they would separate. But there was no need to cheat. These values were the foundation of the love and trust they had built over the years. Elena needed to resolve this problem that tormented her. One day, during a break at work, she confided in her best friend, Christina, telling her everything about her suspicions and discoveries. Christina listened attentively, knowing Charles well, having visited their home for years. She couldn't imagine him being capable of cheating on Elena, as they loved each other very much. However, she couldn't deny that Elena had some plausible elements, though they didn't prove the child's paternity. Christina pondered that the situation was delicate. If Charles was innocent, he would feel offended. Using rationality, she suggested that Elena do a DNA test. She had a friend who owned a laboratory and could expedite the process. Christina advised that after receiving the test result, Elena should talk to her husband, regardless of the outcome. After all, Charles deserved to know what was going on, even if the result was negative. Elena agreed and arranged to collect the samples to take to the laboratory. Charles noticed Elena's strange behavior. She seemed distant, always thoughtful, as if something was bothering her, but she wouldn't say what it was. He tried to ask, but she only said she was tired, worried about work problems. Elena was a nurse, and her routine included working at the hospital, taking care of the house, and charity work at orphanages, something she wouldn't abandon. Charles, on the other hand, was a software developer. He had his own office in a commercial building, but sometimes worked from home. The first time he noticed Elena's behavior, he let it go. After all, he also had his own worries. But as days went by, he realized that something was really bothering his wife. She avoided him, they barely kissed, much less made love. He tried to recall if he had done something wrong, but nothing came to mind. Intrigued, Charles looked for a way to talk to Elena, who was now more closed and irritable. He needed to find out what was bothering her so they could solve this problem together. Unfortunately, he had to travel for work, leaving this conversation for when he returned. He would be away for a week and really didn't want to go, but he had no choice, as it was a very important client and his partner was absent due to a severe health problem with his wife. Before the trip, Charles noticed something intriguing. Elena seemed relieved by his absence. This observation left him even more confused. Had she grown tired of him? Was she having an affair? No, Charles knew Elena was loyal and would never do such a thing. They loved each other, they had always been partners, friends, and lovers. What had changed then? He needed those answers, but knew he would have to wait until he returned. He couldn't talk to his wife over the phone. Elena collected the samples for the DNA test, which would be ready in 7 days. She received the news of her husband's trip with relief, as she would have exactly the time she needed to get the answers she was seeking. The solitude of the empty house was now her ally, providing the necessary space to deal with her emotions and plan the next steps. The DNA test result was finally in her hands, and Elena could feel her heart racing with anticipation. She sat at the kitchen table, where she used to share meals with Charles, but now the space between them seemed bigger than ever. With trembling hands, Elena opened the envelope and carefully read every word of the document. Tears filled her eyes as it confirmed her deepest suspicions. Oliver was, indeed, Charles's son. An overwhelming mix of emotions enveloped her, from betrayal to disappointment and pain. The DNA test result was a harsh blow for Elena. Sitting in her living room, looking at the paper confirming Charles's paternity over Oliver, she felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. On one hand, there was a deep affection for Oliver. He was just an innocent child, a victim of this complicated situation. She remembered his smiles, his joy, how she had grown fond of him. But, on the other hand, he was also the proof of Charles's betrayal, a wound that seemed never to heal. She knew she couldn't just ignore the truth. She loved Charles, but betrayal had always been a non-negotiable boundary in their relationship. He knew that from the beginning, and yet he chose to betray her. She wondered how to tell Charles the truth. She knew it would be the end of their marriage. There was no turning back after this revelation. The trust had been broken in an irreparable way. Looking at the photos of Charles and Oliver, Elena felt a deep pain in her chest. She knew what she had to do, but that didn't make the decision any easier. She would have to confront Charles and face the end of their marriage, a prospect that terrified her. But, above all, she knew she needed to be true to herself and her principles. Elena gathered all the evidence, the photos, and the DNA test, and waited for Charles. He would be returning from his trip today. He had already sent her a message informing her that he had just landed and would take a taxi home. Elena's lack of response made Charles feel uncomfortable. She had avoided him all week, always busy, or, the few times she answered the phone, she was monotone. Something was definitely wrong, and as he headed home, he felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain, hoping it wasn't a sign of something bad. Elena was determined to confront Charles. She called him for a serious conversation in the living room, where everything would be revealed. With trembling hands, she handed him the envelope containing the DNA test result and some photos of Oliver. Charles, confused and surprised, opened the envelope and read the document carefully. His eyes widened as he realized the truth revealed by the words. Before he could say anything, Elena showed him the photos of the child. "Look at him, Charles," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He is your son." Charles looked at the photos, then at Elena, and then back at the photos again. He seemed stunned, unable to process the enormity of what was before him. Elena couldn't contain her emotions any longer. She began to cry, tears streaming down her face as she expressed all her pain and disappointment. "Do you know what hurts the most, Charles?" she asked, her voice laden with sadness. "Oliver is 6 years old, the same age our son would have been if he hadn't died at birth. While I was grieving the loss of our son, you were having a child with someone else. How could you do this to me? How could you betray me like this?" Elena questioned Charles about why Oliver was in the orphanage, why he wasn't with his mother if he was a legitimate child. The questions echoed in the room, filling the air with a heavy silence charged with emotion. The confrontation between Elena and Charles was devastating. Charles was stunned, unable to believe what was happening. He tried to argue, explain, plead for Elena's trust, but his words seemed to get lost in the void. "I swear, Elena, I swear I didn't cheat on you," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how this happened, I don't know who that child is, but I know I didn't cheat on you. Elena, I love you, I would never do something like that." Elena, however, was adamant. The evidence was clear, undeniable. She couldn't just ignore the truth that was before her. Betrayal had always been a boundary for her, a boundary that Charles seemed to have crossed. "I can't do this anymore, Charles," she said, her voice choked with pain. "I can't stay with someone who has broken my trust in this way. I want a divorce." The words fell like a sentence, sealing the fate of their marriage. Elena asked Charles to leave the house, at least temporarily, until they could resolve the bureaucratic issues of the divorce. She advised him to visit the child at the orphanage to fulfill his duties as a father, even if he didn't know how it had happened. Charles, desperate, grabbed his suitcase, the same one he had barely unpacked from the previous trip, and left for a hotel. He was devastated, completely lost in the midst of this turmoil in his life. He had never imagined that something like this could happen, that he could lose Elena over something he swore he hadn't done. Meanwhile, Elena was alone in the house that had once been their home, surrounded by memories of a love that now seemed so distant. She knew it wouldn't be easy to move forward, but she also knew she couldn't live a lie. The truth, as painful as it was the only thing that mattered now. In the hotel, Charles was in a whirlwind of emotions. The idea of having a child outside of marriage was unimaginable to him. He replayed every moment of his life, trying to find some logical explanation for this situation. The birthmark, the physical resemblance to the child, everything seemed to point in the same direction. However, Charles knew in his heart that he had never cheated on Elena, he loved her more than anything and would never endanger their marriage. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Charles went to the orphanage where Oliver was. When he saw the child, something stirred inside him. Oliver was the spitting image of Charles as a child. There was an inexplicable connection between them. Introducing himself as Elena's husband, Charles could perceive the affection Oliver had for his wife. This touched his heart deeply. The doubts and emotions consumed him. Charles decided that he needed to investigate this story thoroughly. He couldn't accept that his marriage would end like this. There was something bigger at play, something he still couldn't understand but was determined to uncover. He chose to speak with the orphanage director, a kind and hopeful woman who saw in Oliver the opportunity for a happy adoption. She spoke about the child with enthusiasm, mentioning how special he was. Those words resonated in Charles's mind as he mentally noted every piece of information she provided. The director explained about Oliver's age and the challenge of adoption for older children. She had a good feeling about Oliver and the possibility of being adopted by the couple. The physical resemblance between Oliver and Charles was striking, something the director had also noticed. As he listened to the director, Charles reflected on his encounter with Oliver. The affection he felt for the boy was genuine. But how could he be his son? He replayed every detail, every conversation with Elena, trying to understand how it was possible without having cheated on his wife. When Charles left the orphanage, his mind was in a whirlwind. He had a clue about Oliver's birth date, but still couldn't piece together all the parts of this confusing puzzle. Was Oliver really his son? How could he explain this to Elena? The doubts and uncertainties consumed him, and he knew he needed to find answers before confronting his wife. Charles was lost in his thoughts, stunned by the absurd possibility that was starting to take shape in his mind. He needed help to understand what was happening. He decided to seek out his friend Liam, a trusted lawyer, and share his doubts and suspicions. Finding Liam in his office, Charles presented the materials Elena had given him and began to recount his theory. He spoke with a mix of anxiety and incredulity, describing how the DNA test indicated that Oliver was his son, although he was sure he had never cheated on Elena. Liam listened attentively, but his expression was skeptical. He questioned if Charles was absolutely sure of his fidelity, something Charles affirmed vehemently. Convinced by his friend's conviction, Liam suggested a new DNA test to confirm his theory. He knew that concrete evidence was essential to dealing with such a delicate situation. Thus, Liam instructed Charles to gather the necessary materials for the new tests while considering the next steps to take. The uncertainty hung in the air, and Charles knew the answers could completely change his life and marriage. Meanwhile, Elena, unaware of her husband's investigation, was immersed in deep sadness. The days seemed colorless since she discovered Charles's betrayal. Loving someone so much and being betrayed in this way was a pain that seemed unbearable. The idea that her marriage had fallen apart left a void in her chest, a void she didn't know how to fill. She hadn't filed for divorce yet, she needed time to process everything that was happening. Since that fateful confrontation over Oliver's paternity, she hadn't seen Charles. For a moment, she considered the possibility of believing him. He seemed sincere in his denial, and his hurt look as he left the house still resonated in her mind. However, the evidence was overwhelming, the photos, the DNA test. How could he not be Oliver's biological father? Nevertheless, Charles, feeling offended and hurt by the situation, still disturbed her. How dare he feel that way when he was the one who broke the marital vows? Days ago, her housekeeper contacted her to inform her that Charles needed to go to their house to pick up some documents. Elena didn't care much about the news. She knew these visits would be necessary for a while, but she asked the housekeeper to ensure she wasn't home when he came. She just didn't want to see him, at least for now. Charles eagerly awaited the test result. He had scheduled a meeting with Liam, as they said the result would be ready today around 2 p.m. His heart was racing, the uncertainty about the result made him fearful. When he finally received the envelope with the result, his hands trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the lines of the document, and suddenly his face lit up. "I knew it," he murmured to himself, as if it were the confirmation of something he had always believed. Showing the result to Liam, his friend could hardly believe what he was seeing. "This is incredible," said Liam, astonished by the turn of events. "Are you going to talk to Elena?" asked Liam, curious about Charles's next steps. "Yes, I need to talk to her," Charles responded, carefully storing the result. "But we need to delve into the second part of the investigation. We need to know how this could have happened." "I agree," said Liam, thoughtfully. "I'll take the necessary steps and request priority in this case. I think we won't have any problems, as this could cause a scandal and bad publicity for them. They should cooperate." Elena decides to visit Oliver at the orphanage. It had been days since she last saw the boy, and she missed him very much. Elena was emotional upon reuniting with Oliver at the orphanage. The boy hugged her affectionately, and she melted with his innocent smile. She felt a deep love for him, even now knowing that he was Charles's son. The situation was bittersweet because, on one hand, she loved Oliver and wanted the best for him, but on the other, it hurt to know he was the product of her husband's betrayal. While spending time with Oliver, Elena tried to push thoughts of Charles aside. She didn't want to ruin the special moment with the boy, but it was hard to ignore her husband's presence in their lives, although he would soon be her ex-husband. Meanwhile, Charles was desperate to talk to Elena. He knew he needed to explain everything and try to fix things between them. Learning she was at the orphanage, he rushed there as quickly as he could. When Charles arrived, he saw Elena and Oliver together, and his heart swelled with emotion. He approached and hugged the boy, feeling a mix of happiness and anxiety. Seeing the father and son embracing, Elena felt a pang in her heart. On one hand, she was happy to see Oliver so well cared for and loved, but on the other, she knew this meant the end of her marriage. She knew it was time to face reality and talk to Charles about the divorce. Although it hurt, she needed to confront the situation head-on. Charles noticed Elena's hesitation and asked her to stay. He knew he needed to explain everything to her and hoped she would understand. The three of them stood there in silence for a moment before Charles finally broke the silence. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "I know things are complicated between us, but there's something important you need to know." In a private area of the orphanage, they both sat down to have this conversation. Elena was tense, waiting for the revelation Charles was about to make. He took a deep breath, took her hands, and said with a trembling voice, "Elena, I know everything seems confusing and painful right now, but there's something I discovered in the tests that will change everything. Oliver is not just my son, he's your son too." Elena's eyes widened, unable to believe what she was hearing. Charles handed her the DNA test results, showing that both were Oliver's biological parents. Tears filled Elena's eyes, mixed with a whirlwind of emotions. She looked at Oliver, who was playing innocently outside, and then at Charles, who looked at her with a mix of hope and apprehension. "How is this possible?" murmured Elena, still stunned by the revelation. Charles explained that Liam was investigating the case and that it was likely a hospital error, a baby swap or something similar. He had just picked up the results and couldn't wait to share this discovery with her. Elena looked at Oliver with new eyes, seeing familiar traits in him that she hadn't noticed before. She felt a whirlwind of emotions, but above all, a sense of relief and gratitude for having her son back. Elena looked into Charles's eyes, holding his hands tightly. "Charles, I'm sorry for not believing in you. I was quick to judge, to think the worst. But now I know the truth and know that you've always been faithful to me. Forgive me for doubting you." Charles smiled softly, caressing her face with his hand. "Elena, there's nothing to forgive. I understand your reaction given the circumstances. The important thing is that now we're together and can move forward stronger than ever." They embraced, feeling the connection and love that had always been there, even in the most difficult moments. "I love you, Charles," whispered Elena. "And I love you, Elena, always and forever," replied Charles, sealing his words with a gentle kiss. "Our son, Charles, Oliver is our son," said Elena, her voice choked with emotion. She looked at Oliver, who was playing innocently on the floor, and then back at Charles. "Yes, we'll get him out of here as soon as possible. Liam is already taking care of that too," continued Charles, holding his wife's hand. Given the circumstances, they were granted temporary custody of Oliver. The family was finally reunited, but the discoveries were far from over. Days later, Liam discovered that there had been an error at the hospital and the babies had been swapped. Oliver had been switched with the baby of a 16-year-old girl. The baby who died was hers, not Elena's, as everyone had believed. This confusion led to the deceased child being mistakenly identified as Elena and Charles's son. Upon leaving the hospital, the young girl gave the child up for adoption due to Oliver's health issues. It was difficult to find parents who could afford his medical treatment, thus, he remained in the orphanage until he reached an age where it was difficult to be adopted. The orphanage could only afford Oliver's treatments thanks to the donations they received. Charles and Elena decided to tell Oliver the truth. They sat together on the couch and explained the entire situation to the boy. Oliver was a little confused at first, but soon smiled and hugged his parents. The family would now live the lost time with much love and happiness. Oliver had a new family, and Charles and Elena had the child they had always wanted. The house was filled with laughter and love, showing that even in the face of the greatest challenges, true love always prevails. Sunlight illuminated the room where Charles, Elena, and Oliver were gathered. Oliver played with his toys while Charles and Elena exchanged loving looks, still incredulous about everything they had been through. Oliver looked up, his eyes shining with joy, and called out, "Dad, Mom." Charles and Elena looked at each other, moved, and approached the boy. Oliver hugged them tightly, feeling safe and loved. "Oliver, my son, we love you so much," said Elena, with tears in her eyes. "Yes, Oliver, we love you very much. We're so happy to have you with us," said Charles, holding Elena and Oliver's hands. The family was united, finally complete. Love and happiness overflowed in that room, showing that even in the face of the greatest challenges, true love always finds its way. Oliver's smile was a reflection of the new life they were starting together. Charles and Elena left behind the pain and distrust, strengthening their love and bond even more. They enjoyed the presence of the son they had longed for and thought they had lost. It was still crazy to think about all this, but for now, they just wanted to enjoy these wonderful family moments together. They walked towards a future filled with happiness and fulfillment, knowing they were united and strong to face any challenge life might bring.